And so there was just these very narrow bands of time that you had to have the soluble calcium ready to go to make it to the tissue of a fruiting plant. And again, we can also use foliar sprays for quicker uptake. But again, it's very hot in Texas, so that was even hard. Transpiration would happen quicker than the fruit could uptake it. But it just seemed very weird to me that I was being told to add more calcium to fix a problem in a soil that had so much calcium in the first place.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, Nina Prater is joined by her fellow NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialists, Darron Gaus and Lee Rinehart, to explore calcium. Calcium is an essential plant nutrient and a basic soil cation that has a big impact on soil pH. So whether your soil is naturally high or naturally low in calcium, this episode will guide you in managing this nutrient. Let's listen.
Soil chemistry is a complex dance between minerals, biological activity, water, climate, and more. There are so many factors that impact a soil's chemistry. Today, we are going to talk about an element that has a significant impact on a soil's chemistry, calcium. We've covered nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in other episodes that we will link to. And we're going to just keep going through the soil macronutrients, starting with calcium. So I'm joined by my colleagues, Darron Gaus and Lee Rinehart. Thanks for joining me to talk about calcium today.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. I'm glad to be a part of this nutrient mini-series we're doing.
Yeah, welcome, welcome. So I'd like to start, like we have in all of these episodes, by talking a little bit about the history of how people managed calcium in the past, pre-modern era. Because I found some fun stories and interesting stories about calcium and how people used it historically. Then we'll move into the actual sort of chemistry about calcium and how to use it as a way to affect soil pH. We're going to talk about it as a plant nutrient and its IPM uses, and some about sort of the controversial look at base cation saturation. What is it, Lee? the practice of balancing.
Yeah, it's the base cation saturation ratio. That was developed back in like the early 1900s. So yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, so it's going to be a wide-ranging conversation about calcium. And so let's get started. It wasn't until, the 1800s where chemists like our friend Justus von Liebig started really identifying elements in isolation, individual elements like calcium. But before then, people knew about the benefits of soil calcium. Even if they didn't call it calcium, they might have called it lime or something like that. But they were aware of this problem that to be productive, they needed this certain element. And they would call soils sweet if they were good soils, or sour if they were poorly performing acidic soils. Because for centuries, millennia, people have used all their senses to assess their soils, including taste. Have you guys ever tasted soil?
Oh, absolutely. I've tasted soil. I've done plenty of face plants in the garden and on football fields to know exactly what different soils taste like. But I thought that was really incredible that people are, were using taste, and I'm sure people still do, How do you calibrate your tongue to the pH of a soil? I think that's probably one of our bits of knowledge in our agronomy toolbox that we might have lost. Given the MPK soil testing, chemical analysis, I wonder if there's anybody out there listening who still can tell the difference between sweet and sour, high pH and low pH just by testing. I'm going to try it.
Yeah, I've never done it, and you'd think I would have in all my years of being a big fan of soil, but I guess, I've had it if I eat a carrot straight from the ground or something,
Mhm.
but not like tasting it to try and test for anything.
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna
then
start paying
salty,
attention.
people can taste if soils are salty, which is, another
Mhm.
problem.
Mhm.
So I just thought that was super interesting that, people have always identified, and they called it sour, they
Mhm.
knew it was acidic. I thought that was really cool. And so one of the earliest forms of calcium that was used as a soil amendment was this substance called marl. And from an 1855 Morton's Cyclopedia of Agriculture, they describe marl as an unctuous, clayey, chalky, or sandy earth of calcareous nature. And marls were of variable character, but they all had to possess some portion of lime in their composition before they merited the name. So people had this substance called marl, probably before it was easy to mine and grind up limestone
Did
loose.
you do any more reading on marl? Because it makes me think, is it just like a deposit, that people would just found and dug up? I mean, just like people would dig up peat or they'd go find guano or anything like that.
Yeah, it was this, they'd find deposits of this sediment, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found a history of sort of the practice around digging up marl. So let me read you this quote. It's from
Mm-hmm.
a history of Upton by Chester in England,
On
which is
marl
like
pits.
on marl pits, which is like the most English name,
Mm-hmm.
Upton
Oh
by
yeah.
Chester. So, documentation reveals that marling continued in general use throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries through an era in advances in agriculture, such as the enclosure of land, the introduction of new crops like peas, and the rotation of crops. So it was used throughout, even with all these other innovations. It was found that fields left fallow to help restore their fertility were unproductive for a season, but marling helped to overcome the problem. The marl remained effective for about 12 years before sinking. That was
Sinking.
another sinking. And the value of dung as a fertilizer was well known. However, as much of the winter stock were killed off each autumn, it was difficult to accumulate sufficient dung as fertilizer. That was another little tidbit I didn't realize in terms of like livestock management.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize they would kill them off, a large percentage of them off in the winter, although that makes sense
Yeah.
if you don't
Yeah,
have
because
means to um, feed them all winter. But so here's more about marling. Over the years, marling became a part of the local way of life. It was hard work carried out by a group of 5 or 6 men under a leader known as the Lord of the Pit.
there's a movie right there.
Absolutely. The work usually lasted a fortnight, and when it was finished for the year, there was much merrymaking in the village. Stimulated by the increased price in food prices for food crops in the 1790s, many marl pits were dug, but by the mid-19th century, the practice of marling was dying out. Even though marl was available and free, it needed a great deal of labor for excavation, haulage, and spreading. Labor for such tasks was now in short supply, as many of the younger and more adventurous villagers had begun to seek their fame and fortune overseas in the colonies or in the
Oh
growing
my goodness.
manufacturing industries. I know, isn't this interesting?
Well, we've always had like rural flight, even
Yeah.
from the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
More than anything, that story just makes me feel lazy. Just imagining all those shovel by shovel, cart by cart, pulling one soil to the next
Hmm.
compared to our beautiful technologies today.
Yeah, like spreaders,
Mhm.
ground-driven spreaders, right? Well, this
Yeah.
is interesting. What else?
Okay. As a result, the practice of marling became expensive, costing about £5 an acre. It was also a time when alternative fertilizers such as lime, bone dust, sea sludge, soda, and salt began arriving in the Upton by canal, and the improving road network. So they were able to get these resources from farther away because transportation had improved. And then the improving methods of agriculture was seeing the growing of fodder and enable the overwintering of more stock. This practice provided an all-year-round source for the best enrichment of soil, natural manure.
Isn't it amazing how they're both like connected?
Yeah.
Calcium and manuring and everything. I mean, it's just showing you the integrated nature, of agronomy, really.
Right. Right. And how changing practices are impacted by so many different things: industrialization,
Mhm.
transportation improvement, and all of this stuff. So just thought that was super interesting. So this marl was yeah, basically dug from the ground as a loose substrate and then spread on fields. And that was our first one of the early examples of calcium as applied to soil. And I thought that was very fascinating. And you're right, Lord of the Pit. Great movie opportunity.
Yeah, I mean the whole thing was written like a story, and I'm just thinking, like Darren was just kind of imagining people out on the land, just digging this stuff up and spreading it out on the fields and then really just finding how it just loosened up. I mean, obviously, I mean it's calcium, right? So we know what calcium does, right? It tends to kind of help clay particles flocculate together into aggregates and provide that stability, that part of that aggregate stability that we associate with really good healthy soils. And so that must have been what they're seeing, that they were seeing, increased organic matter, increased, especially with the addition of manures and even green manures, which have been used for a long time. Maybe we need to do a pod on green manure sometime. That would be really cool. But yeah, I just think of all of these integrated methods and the observation that they must have been doing back then, and they landed on something something basic, no pun intended, um
Sorry, that was a really good pun.
thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's telling too that like it was such hard work. It was so many man hours. They wouldn't have done that if they weren't sure that it was going to be beneficial and worth it. Like
Well, right. I mean, in addition to helping out with soil aggregation, it was kind of stabilizing that pH, right?
mhm,
Bringing
mhm.
that up into an area where more nutrients are available. Of course, they didn't have the soil science to know what was going on. They just saw that, oh my gosh, we're getting better forages. We can put forages away and keep animals through the winter now. And now we have more manure, and it kind of like, then that kind of agricultural revolution starts to kind of get traction. But I know that one thing that was happening during this time that they couldn't have known, and this has to do with the sweet and the sour, is that pH was starting to stabilize into that zone. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about pH, because that's one of the big things that's happening here.
Yeah, let's talk about pH. It is related to calcium in a number of ways, but it is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions, H plus, versus OH minus, hydroxide ions. So if a soil, or if anything, water or whatever, is acidic, it means there's more hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions. And vice versa. If it is alkaline, there's more OH minus
Hmm.
hydroxide ions. So it's this really simple measurement, but once you get it out into the real world in the soil, there are so many different things, different elements and things like that, that impact the concentration of those two elements. So and it fluctuates all of the time. Plants are impacting the pH of the soil all the time too. So where does calcium fit in with this balance? I found a really good explanation. So in the measure of pH, we're just measuring hydrogen and hydroxide, but different ions affect the pH, and some are called basic ions and some are called acidic, depending on which way they move the needle in the soil. So aluminum cations are considered acidic because they react with water and produce one AlOH3 molecule and then 3 hydrogen molecules. So they're adding hydrogen to the soil. But then calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, among others, are considered basic because they form strongly dissociated bases by reacting with OH minus.
So that makes me think, it's like if you look at the soil particle, right, that's got a negative charge to it. And all these cations, they have positive charges. And so the aluminum, it makes sense if the aluminum in soil solution being that Al, 3 plus, is going to produce this aluminum hydroxide and free up all of these hydrogens that are and they're plus, they're positive. They're going to start grabbing onto those soil particles, and the more sites that are taken by these hydrogen ions, the less sites are available for calcium and for magnesium and for all of these other potassium, sodium cations that are essential plant nutrients. And that's how I understand, I think, what's going on with low pH. Does that make sense? Am I kind of getting it like right in a very basic elementary fashion?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And the thing that the point that you bring up about these cation exchange sites is really important, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit, because the soil's cation exchange capacity has a big impact on how much lime to add and things like that.
Right.
And Lee, you and Margot Hale did a podcast on pH that really explains a lot too. That if anybody wants to go check that, I think it was episode 164. We'll link it in the show notes if you want to get a little bit more in depth to pH.
That's a good idea, Darren, because that one's back there in the library. It needs to be. We need to bring it out and give it some love. So we're going to post that one on the show notes.
Yeah. So, a lot of people add calcium carbonate, which is lime, which is ground up limestone. And limestone is basically a broad category of minerals that are predominantly calcium carbonate. And so calcium carbonate is CaCO3. And, people add lime to adjust the pH, to increase the pH, to get it within the happy zone of 6 to 7, ish, but it's not mainly the calcium portion of that molecule that changes pH, which is a common misunderstanding. It's the carbonate portion. So the calcium and the CO3 split, and the calcium becomes the cation, Ca2 plus, and the carbonate binds up with those free loose H hydrogen ions in the soil, and they create bicarbonates and hydroxides, the OH minus. So they take some of the hydrogen out of the soil solution and they release the hydroxides. I know this is a little confusing, and probably there's chemists out there going, "Oh, geez, you guys."
Oh, this is the way farmers understand soil, Nina.
Okay.
This is great, But I start thinking of it as it's gonna bind up those free ions so that they're not going to bind to the soil colloids. Now you've got room for your other nutrient cations, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, to bind, right?
Yeah. So we're trying to make as many of those, basic cations present as we can,
Right.
or the
Right.
plants to take up. And so there's a good pH for our plants to grow in, and for all the soil microbes too. So let's zoom way out and talk about soil on sort of a macro scale. Like, what causes some soils to tend to be more acidic and some soils to tend to be more basic? Some tend to be low in calcium and some tend to be higher in calcium. So one of the things that can influence that is how much rainfall is in a region. If there's a lot of rainfall, calcium, which is easily dissolved in water, will leach out of the soil. And so you'll have lower calcium levels and lower pH. But then in arid regions like the western US, and where Darron lives in Texas, there's a lot less rainfall, so calcium can build up over hundreds of years. And so there's naturally higher pHs. And another thing that can affect it is the parent material of the soil. So what minerals did those soils weather from? And some minerals are naturally higher in calcium than others, so that will have an impact as well.
Imagine some of this, buildup here in Texas. On my grandfather's farm where he grew up, they had dug what he called ecology pit. It was basically, the country version of the trash system. That's where all the trash went. But when he dug this pit, we used it for so many other things, and it was just so amazing as a kid to look at this 10-foot wall of what looked like sidewalk chalk all the way around. And it was just, what we call caliche, which was the buildup of that calcium carbonate, just packed on each other over and over and over again. And literally it was just a 10-foot deep, it was just 6 inches below the top horizon of soil of a white wall of chalk. It was pretty amazing to see.
Try sinking a fence post in that, right?
Yeah, was it like really cement-like in the lower
The deeper that you went that wasn't oxygenated, it was definitely harder. But when the surface was on the face of something, it was very soft like chalk. You could pick it with your fingernail and it would come off.
Cool. I love a good soil pit. Yeah, and here in Arkansas, if you dig a pit, you just get down to red dirt. It's just really iron rich, not a lot of calcium.
But
How
that's
about
on another episode.
Yeah. Yeah. How about Pennsylvania, Lee?
We got some pretty good agricultural soils in Pennsylvania with the ridges and valleys of the Appalachians that kind of run from southwest to northeast. The valleys are, the river valleys are really pretty deep. I mean, some of the best farmland in the country, they say, is in Lancaster, about 2 hours, 2.5 hours south of me. And where I am I'm kind of on a 1,200 feet on kind of a ridge side, right? The kind of a side of the ridge is very, very rocky soil, but the soil is very friable and very, very, very tilthy. There's a lot of organic matter. This basically is woods, so there's a lot of organic matter here. And so with the addition of more of organic matter on our soils in Pennsylvania, calcium can be regulated a little bit easier by the addition of organic matter and just maintaining that organic fraction. That's what I've seen on my gardens here.
Well, that's a great segue because I want to talk about the cation exchange capacity now. And for those who don't know, cations are positively charged ions. And the cation exchange capacity of a soil is its capacity to hold those cations on the surfaces of the soil particles or organic matter particles. So a higher cation exchange capacity means you have the ability to hold more of these cations. So finer textured soils like, clay or silty soils have more surface area, so they have a higher cation exchange capacity than like a sandy soil, which has less surface area. And I think of it in my head as like parking spaces for these cations. And you want more of them. So you want to be able to park more on the soil surfaces so that they can readily dissolve into the water in the soil, and then plants can take them up. And so that can really impact how much calcium your soil can hold, whether you have sandy soil or a more clay loam soil, for example. And so this informs your soil's buffering capacity. Do you guys know the term buffering capacity?
Whenever I think of, now, I'm just going to wing it here, right? Because when I think of buffering capacity, I'm thinking of like the ratio of the different cations that are present on soil particles. Am I just way off?
Yeah, you're off.
Nina
So-
and I have known each other long enough to just be bluntly honest with each other.
Yeah, you're wrong. No. So it's like a soil's ability to withstand change.
Okay.
So if you've got a higher cation exchange capacity, you've got a really high buffering capacity, because it's going to take a lot more calcium. Say you're adding lime. It's going to take a lot more lime to make a change in the percentage of calcium in that soil, to change the pH, basically.
Right.
It's going to take a lot more because it's more resistant to change. If you have a low buffering capacity, like in a sandy soil, you don't have to add as much lime to increase
to make a big change. So it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So now we got buffering capacity. So just to understand that, because it's going to affect like how you apply, how much lime you apply and stuff like that.
Seems like the biggest help of buffering capacity then would be organic matter.
Yes.
Not only for pH, but this calcium buffer, like there's, it's high in the cation exchange capacity, and it's got all these nutrients working through its as it breaks down. Seems like that would be one of the best potentials for that buffering capacity.
Yeah, definitely. Because we can't really change our soil texture, but you can certainly add organic matter to the soil through your management. And that's really the only way to increase your buffering capacity. So thank you, Darron. Yes. And I found one other cool link when I was researching for this podcast that I wanted to share. It's some recent research on the link between calcium and organic matter. And I'm just going to throw it in here because it's kind of related. It was a study that suggested that by adding calcium, it allows the soil to retain more carbon in the soil. And so, of course, this is something we want to do for a number of reasons. But I'm just going to quote from the article about this paper. We showed that by adding calcium to soil, we changed the community of microbes in the soil and the way they process organic matter, explained Itamar Shabtai, assistant professor of science at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station and lead author of the investigation, in a statement released by the laboratory. Microorganisms in particular reportedly acted more efficiently. They processed it in a more efficient manner. More carbon was retained in the soil and less was lost to the atmosphere as CO2. So, I thought that was super cool because we're always talking about trying to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in the soils. So adding calcium can enhance that process.
Do you think that is just a function of if you build it, they will come? In other words, really just kind of making a good habitat for soil microorganisms, perhaps. And so then you get more abundance, more diversity. You've got the organic matter in there. And we know that organic matter, like we said before, and calcium work together to build that microbial habitat, that soil aggregation. So it only seems natural then, right? I mean, to me, that you've got organic matter and then you've got more flocculation and more aggregation. Now you're going to sequester more carbon as well.
Yeah, it seems kind of intuitive when you say it like that. I haven't read the whole paper, so I don't know if they have any other explanations. I'm curious about the way they say they processed it in a more efficient manner. I'm like, okay,
Exactly.
what is that efficient manner? Let's find out about that. So we can link to that article in the show notes if people want to explore. So that's sort of the relationship of calcium to other nutrients in the soil and soil pH, but we haven't really talked about why add calcium as a plant nutrient, because we don't need it just for pH, but the plants also need it too. And Darron, you had a really interesting story about this on your farm that I thought was especially interesting considering you're in an environment of naturally high calcium in the soil. So,
Yes,
take it away.
super high amounts of calcium. So I farmed in the south side of San Antonio, Texas, and it was where this calcareous, region met with the Houston Blackland clay. So very high in clay, very high in calcium. At the time we were growing all kinds of vegetables, and I was seeing blossom end rot occur a lot in tomatoes, peppers, even the squashes. Either the flowers were aborting or they would get, immature fruit and then start rotting from that tip point. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of what blossom end rot is. So you talk to extension agents or, your local TA provider and they're saying, well, you're lacking calcium. Well, how can that be? That just blew my mind. How can we have too much calcium and we have clay soils that have this, tons of cation exchange capacity, but yet the calcium itself is not being used properly to mitigate this blossom end rot. Why would you want to add more calcium to a soil that has so much in it? A lot of that is, like you said, we're in an arid region, and one of the calcium carbonate that is soluble needs water. And so a lot of it tended to be just the unavailable times of water, 105-degree heat, you just couldn't keep up with the water. And calcium is also, fast moving. We can kind of break some of these things down as I learned, but I also learned, the two parts of the plant that do water and nutrient uptake is xylem and phloem. Well, xylem is the major highway for this water soluble calcium carbonate, but in especially like tissues like fruit, it depended mostly on phloem. And so there was just these very narrow bands of time that you had to have the soluble calcium ready to go to make it to the tissue of a fruiting plant. And so that's where, again, we can also use foliar sprays for quicker uptake. But again, it's very hot in Texas, so that was even hard. Transpiration would happen quicker than the fruit could uptake it. But yeah, I mean, we can break down some of those things, but it just seemed very weird to me that I was being told to add more calcium to fix a problem in a soil that had so much calcium in the first place. But it's all about the timing and that water soluble. I think I read somewhere that like apples need 90% of their calcium within 6 to 8 weeks of flowering. So it's very important, on something like that, that you're watering and calcium is readily available right then in that small window of time.
Do you think if you would have had drip irrigation, that would have alleviated the problem?
We did have drip irrigation, especially like where we were growing tomatoes. We used drip irrigation on one of our farms. We did have flood irrigation, but most of it was drip irrigation. And no, it's still, we tried to get very scientific and started using the ET ratings, the evapotranspiration ratings of how much was lost the day before, and that's what we were trying to put in the next day. But as much as I do, Lee, you lived in Texas once. It's hard to keep up with water when it's 105 degrees and just so humid too. What we ended up doing though to fix this, it actually wasn't about adding more calcium, we tried to just focus on making that calcium readily available. And so we would add things like elemental sulfur to start breaking off some of that calcium from the cation exchange sites, and then therefore making it, calcium sulfate. And then those were not only lowering the pH. By the way, our pH was almost 8. Sometimes I think there was 8.4 in one field, and it would start lowering that pH. But what really, we saw some, evidence that the blossom end rot was going down. But what really started changing things is I started doing no-till and like green manuring and cover crops, and really just started focusing on organic matter. And once I focused on organic matter, that's when now I know that the buffering capacity was much higher. Wow. And we started not seeing blossom end rot anymore.
That is super interesting. Yeah, and also with higher organic matter, it's possible that moisture stayed in the soil just a little bit longer.
Yep, that's all you needed, was that water to stick around to solubilize that calcium to make it available.
Yeah, and we'll talk about sulfur too in another episode. But yeah, sulfur is frequently added to lower the soil's pH. So yeah, because once you get too high of a pH, it limits a nutrient uptake as well.
Don't have time to stay up to date on the freshest sustainable agriculture news, events, and funding opportunities? You can trust NCAT to keep you connected with our weekly harvest e-newsletter. Subscribe today at ncat.org and get your weekly harvest delivered each Wednesday.
Very interesting. It's so funny to be in a place in Arkansas where the soils around us are like hovering around 5.5. And you have the 8.5 problem. So yeah, just goes to show that context really matters.
So yeah, that just really put calcium in the forefront for me, just to focus on that for my farming, and just getting that nutrient cycle improved. And then, I come across in 1958 the first edition of Soil Fertility and Animal Health by William Albrecht. He calls calcium the premier of the soil's nutrient elements, the premier. So he saw its focus too.
Yeah, he did. I was recently reading one of his papers, and for those who don't know William Albrecht, he was, back in the early 1900s, he was a professor, Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station, and he did a lot of work with calcium and was really pretty much convinced that it, like you said, it was the premier element of the soils. I mean, we always think carbon and nitrogen, but again, this is a complex natural system, and all of these elements have their place. But Albrecht did a lot of work with soybeans, and he found that he didn't call it the premier one in this paper, he called it the requisite nutrient for growth in soybeans. The soybeans didn't require nitrogen, but so the most prevalent nutrient that they needed was calcium. And something that I found really interesting was he was talking about pH and hydrogen and plant growth. And specifically, Albrecht's idea was that soil acidity really is a symptom of a problem and not the malady of the problem. It's not low soil pH per se that causes problems with plant growth, but it was because of what he says is the exit of hydrogen from the soil profile that allows for other nutrient cations to be replaced by the hydrogen. So whenever the hydrogen is taking up all of these, remember we talked about cation exchange capacity, when the hydrogen is taking up all these places, the soil pH is lowered, and so you don't have a lot of sites for calcium specifically, which we want to have at around a 3-to-1 calcium magnesium ratio in order to get that really good soil till. So I thought that was really interesting that he would say that soil acidity is kind of like it's a flag for us that something is happening with the cation exchange there, and we need to do something in order to allow for more of the calcium that's there to actually flocculate and come together and be available for plants. And I think, Darron, your story just shows exactly that in action.
Yeah, I think that was the case. And then, I'm also interested to hear from you, Lee. What do we use and how do we use it? How do we use calcium in a low pH soil? What do we add or look at in a low pH? Whereas I had such a high pH, I'm sure that, I've heard a lot of
Right.
people using lime and gypsum as sources of calcium in low pH soils.
Yeah,
How does
I
that work?
think, well, if you have a low pH soil, you're going to want to use something like a high calcium limestone to help to bring that pH up and supply that calcium. Gypsum, probably shouldn't be substituted for that limestone on acidic soils because gypsum is gonna supply the elemental calcium, right? You remember whenever earlier in our talk, Nina was talking about the hydroxide and the what was it, the carboxide that you were talking
Carbonate.
about? The carbonate, right, that actually causes that change. So if you're in a low pH soil and it's kind of sandy, then I think the high calcium limestone is definitely what you're going to need in order to both affect the soil pH as well as add calcium to the soil. And dolomitic limestone, if you're also kind of low in magnesium.
And as you add these calciums, you mentioned how calcium can help flocculate or aggregate the soil.
Mhm.
Is there a potential that this soil, the calcium, can kind of hesitate in the horizons of soil and almost make a impenetrable hard pan as it flocculates and aggregates?
I haven't seen any research on that. Usually it's magnesium that does that. Usually it's magnesium that causes soils to become a lot tighter, and calcium tends to kind of break them up and make them aggregate a little better so that you've got pore space, right? That's where calcium, both with calcium and organic matter tied together, really increase our cation exchange capacity.
Yeah, and in terms of adding lime to soil, I have a livestock farm here in Arkansas, and so we never till our soil. It's permanent pasture. So we surface apply lime once every 5 years or so based on our soil tests if we need it. But if you do incorporate it, it will change the pH faster. Because that's another thing about lime is it doesn't change the pH the day you add it.
Mhm.
It takes a little while to either soak into the soil or then for that whole chemical interaction to happen. So a lot of times around here, people apply it in the fall so that the next growing season you're ready to go.
And even then, applied on a perennial pasture like that, you're probably not going to get much of a change, but maybe an inch of soil depth every year. I mean, it takes a long time for these things to change. But once you prime the system, and if you've got a lot of organic matter, in that soil, and if you're grazing right, if you're using those animals and and you allow for adequate regrowth, for full regrowth of the plants, and you really pump that system with organic matter, that can really help speed things up too.
Yeah, I get a lot of questions from people about like different liming products that they see in the store. Have you guys ever looked at those like pelletized lime or things like that?
Well, I mean, I've always think about surface area, That's what I want. If I want to affect a change in my soil from a pH standpoint, and I'm putting lime on, I want to get the best bang for my buck. And so I'm going to make sure that it is a fine ground limestone, so that it gets in there and it's got a lot of surface area and it's going to break down faster. I haven't seen any research, and I've never used pellets. I've only ever used just like bagged lime, right? But intuitively, it just seems to me that the pellets, are going to take longer to break up.
Yeah,
Somebody out
yeah.
there who uses pellets, email me and tell me I'm wrong. But that's kind of where my brain goes.
Well, yeah, what I've heard about pellets is, there's no regulation or anything on the binding agent. So
Oh
you don't
yeah.
know how fast or slow it is going to dissolve.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's mostly used, honestly, in like sort of landscaping or golf course type scenarios where you don't want a bunch of powdery white stuff blowing around.
Oh, gotcha.
So I always also recommend like a nice finely ground limestone. The finer ground, the faster it'll change your pH. But if you get kind of a bit of a mix, that means you'll have some fast release and some sort of more slower release calcium. So I think there's some benefit to that when managing your pH. Here's the thing about lime is it has to be mined from somewhere and then ground from somewhere. So it might not be harmful to your fields at all when you apply it. Like it is a good source of nutrients, natural source of nutrients, but it does have an environmental impact with the mining and, people who live next to those mines have to hear blasting and there's trucks and dust. And so it's not environmentally neutral, I wouldn't say. So I think it's important to consider doing the appropriate grazing management so you have good organic matter. There's things you can do, anything you can do to keep a biologically active soil, like Darron, like you were talking about with the cover crops and green manures and stuff like that. That's going to reduce the number of times that you have to apply lime, which I think is a really good benefit. And then there's other sources of calcium carbonate that we can find.
Maybe we need to go back to the marling, put the extra effort into it. Stop using
Yeah,
those tools and
just dig our own marl pits on each farm. I don't know how far you'd have to go from where I am to find a marl pit. Yeah, I mean, that's one solution. There's also, poultry litter has, I think I found a table of different substances and how much calcium. So poultry manure has 80 pounds of calcium per ton. That's not nothing.
No.
Legume hay, if you're feeding legume hay, that's 28 pounds. Clams and oyster shells, 680 pounds per ton of calcium.
Right.
Wood ashes,
Bone
70.
meal.
Bone meal.
Yeah. And also, I don't know if anybody out there has used aragonite. I've never used it, but it's basically a seawater derived calcium that's about 35 to 38% calcium. It's readily available, and it's approved for use on organic farms as well. Very natural. So again, like anything where you're doing extraction, you've got to look at the method and and how's this stuff being done. But I think you make a really good point, Nina, and that is our soil health practices. That is where we can really manage with a buffering effect from the management standpoint, right? To really develop a resilient system that can kind of recycle nutrients of its own, because most soils do have calcium in them, but most of the times because of pH or, like you said, Darron, low rainwater, this type of thing, it's not available, right? But it's a ubiquitous chemical, and most good agricultural soils have, within base saturation, about 65 to 70% of those sites on a soil colloid are going to be occupied by calcium. It's a big portion, right, of the profile. So I think whatever we can do to add organic matter and to keep the soil covered and keep the temperatures buffered, whatever we can do to keep water in the soil profile, I think is going to positively impact our crop yields and sustainability and resilience. And like you said earlier, reduce the need for having to lime all the time, I mean, it costs money to lime. right?
Yeah. Even if you don't, if you have any qualms about mining limestone,
Right,
it's
right.
expensive.
It's expensive. Yeah, yeah, you got to come out and buy it and spread it and and then worry, did I put on too much, too little?
Hmm.
How do
Yeah.
I interpret the soil report?
Right. So, I'm sorry, I got us off track because Lee, you were going to talk a little bit about William Albrecht, and one of his theories about the percentage getting your base cations balanced, and sort of some of the conversation about that.
Oh yeah, I just think it's fascinating, because there's a lot of farmers and practitioners out there who are using Albrecht's methods, right? I think of Gary Zimmer, people like that, who are looking at balancing the ratio of the different cations that are within the soil profile to get to like the correct ratio of calcium to magnesium. And I know a lot of farmers who will use what's called the base saturation method. There's a lot of farmers who will swear by it, and it's working for them. And then enough to that some of the land grant universities are looking into it now. And most research that has been done, I mean, we're talking, reductive research on small plots within universities and such, have not found like any significant yield differences or plant health differences by using the base saturation ratio method. They have mostly found differences in yield as a result of pH, right? But again, I start thinking of pH, and what's that doing? You're locking up hydrogen. Calcium's not available, right? So I don't know. I think the question's open. I know that Ohio State's doing some work. They're looking into it. They're looking into this old Albrecht method to actually do some like research on farms with farmers who are using it, right? So they're taking it out of the laboratory and they're doing field scale. They've been doing some field scale work on it. And I'll be happy to see what else comes of that kind of work. But I don't know. It just tells me, we're always learning when it comes to soil. I mean, with all of these nutrients, we have a basic understanding of how they move and how they behave and act in the presence of each other and of water and without water. I mean, it's just like soil microorganisms. I mean, microbiologists say that we probably have identified 1% of all of the soil microorganisms that are out there, It's just an incredible ecosystem. And I think that looking at all different aspects is profitable, We like to look at chemical reports. We need to look at biological reports. And I think maybe we should look at base saturation and just and see what we can learn from that.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge how young the field of soil science is. I mean, it's really still, I think we're in the, toddler stage of understanding our soils. And so
yeah.
keeping our minds open to these different practices and studying them methodically, and also seeing on-farm results of practices and things like that, just, continuing to add to the understanding.
I was listening to one of the Real Organic presentations at EcoFarm a couple of years ago, and one of the speakers said, look down into the soil is every bit as much as and I'm paraphrasing, right? But that is every bit as much the universe as looking up into the stars, I mean, we know more about some heavenly bodies out there than we know about what goes on underneath the sea and what goes on underneath the soil here. It's a good time with given the tools that we have to be able to go on that adventure and start a career in soil microbiology. I mean, you're not going to run out of something to study.
Absolutely. Yeah. We all just got to get in the magic school bus and shrink down.
That's it.
And
Oh,
go
my
look at
goodness.
the soil. So have we said everything there is to say about calcium ever in the universe and everything?
Well, we've probably like far surpassed my knowledge in calcium. I've learned a lot reading about it and listening to you guys. But and it just makes me think because I am kind of an intuitive gardener, and I rely on the soil health practices and cover crops and green manures and rotations and such like that. And I pay more attention to carbon than I paid to anything else. I stopped paying attention to nitrogen. We got, 78% nitrogen or so in the air. I got plenty of nitrogen. All I have to do is make sure that the bugs in the ground can get it, right? And it needs carbon to do that. Well, I think what I've learned by listening to you guys and having this conversation and doing a little reading is what else can I learn about some of these macronutrients, right?
For sure.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think it's great to focus in on a specific macronutrient and learn about it and study it, acknowledging that that it's part of a complex and holistic ecosystem. And you don't have to, worry about calcium. People farmed for millennia without worrying about what all these chemical formulas, they just tasted their soil and adjusted.
Why don't we go back to the sweet and sour test? I think I like that.
I'm going to go try it right now.
Yeah.
I just have to find a part of my garden that the ducks and chickens haven't gotten into, because I don't want to end up with any health problems as a result. But
that would be sweet and sour.
Yeah. So, but I'm going to try it. Anyway, I guess this is all just to say that it's great. I love zooming in on a specific element and then like zooming back out again and seeing sort of how it all interacts as a whole.
Yeah. Well, and I just have to thank you for having the courage to bring us on this journey, because we're not soil scientists, we're practitioners, and we're trying to understand it, and we're asking more questions than anything. And there's a lot to learn, right? And so maybe folks, listening can get some ideas, and maybe they'll have a different look at their soil test next time, and say, what is calcium doing in my soil?
And see the relationship between magnesium and sulfur as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to include sulfur on this episode, and I wanted to include magnesium, but calcium just it needed its own time and space. So we'll get to those.
Yeah, I want to do that. And I want to look at aluminum and iron and some of these other things that on the other end of the spectrum that cause other, like, how do some elements cause other elements to be less available, right? Because of soil pH changes, right? So I think that stuff is fascinating as well.
I've still been curious since the beginning of the show, though, ever since you taught us about marling. If you were to marl a cherry orchard, who then becomes Lord of the Pit? The guy that is in the pit digging the marl, or the harvester that's been eating too many cherries and has pits in his pockets?
That's why I love hanging with you, Darron.
I think they have to duke it out at the end of the season. You just get the two lords of the pits together and see which one wins for the year. Then they get crowned until next year.
Tell you what, the cherry pit guy is going to have a lot more energy than the guy that's been shoveling for days.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, gosh. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. And we will link to our sources for this episode and some additional resources on pH and lime and stuff like that in the show notes for people to check out. And as well as the NPK episodes that we did. And, keep an eye out for the next macronutrient in line. All right.
Thank you, guys. It's fun hanging with you guys as always.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.